record, share my screen. Boom. Let's go here. So I've created a new React app here. Oh, something in the chat already. What about the picture in front of Coding Dojo logo in school? Yeah, seriously. We'll find a way to make that happen as soon as we can get back into the campus, you know. You can take a picture in front of the walkabout Coding Dojo wall. All right. Yeah, good idea. Cool. So I've created this new Create React app. I did it a little bit ahead of time so that we didn't have to kind of wait for things to load up. First, I wanted to just ask, how many people have heard of Redux? Francis heard of it. Okay.
I just heard about it, but I don't know what it does.
Yeah, sure. It's like, what is this thing, right? Okay. So far in our apps, we've had some pretty basic state management where we're just managing things somewhat on a component level, right? Is it related to React admin? What is that, Prativa? Is that like a template or something that you're talking about or asking about?
I think I'll talk about it later. I React admin. I saw the term Redux with the React admin, so I was kind of confused.
Okay. So yeah, my guess is that React admin is probably a template of some sort that has some functionality built into it that you can just customize for a project. Pretty sure that's what that is. But yeah, Albert is saying here that he's guessing that Redux is something like context, and he's on the right track there. So what context does is it allows us to create state somewhere inside of our application, and it allows us to not have to keep passing things down to the inner components from that point. So we can create sort of this wrapper component that's holding all of this state for us, and then we can allow our inner components to reach out and grab pieces of that state and or modify the state however we want. So you can see how this might become power cutoff, geez. You could see how this might become useful if you've got something that's being tracked throughout your entire application. So for instance, let's say we were trying to build some sort of a shopping cart application, an e-commerce type deal, and we go from page to page. Well, I'm going to want to know what is in that user's cart when they get to a different page, right? And I don't necessarily want to have to pass this down as props to every single thing that may need to have access to it. That's where context can come into play. It can allow us to just create the state in a certain place in the app and then have all of the inner components having access to it. Okay? Redux is going to do something very similar to us, or to that. The difference being that Redux also has some built-in functionality that will allow us to change this state that we're creating, okay? So the idea behind Redux is that we've got a global state for our application. So what we're going to do here to get started is I'm going to install a couple of dependencies that we'll need. Okay, so we're going to go npm I, and the two things that we'll need are Redux and React-Redux. Okay, Redux itself is not tied to React, and it can be used with whatever framework you're working in. In fact, it could even be used with vanilla JavaScript if you wanted to. Okay, but the React-Redux library is the library that's going to tie Redux in to our React app. Okay, any questions about that? No? All right. Yeah, so the main thing that I want you guys to be getting from this here is that we're trying to create some global state in our application, not just a localized state that's available at the component level. All right, so while we're waiting for that to install, let's open up our source here. Okay, And I'm going to create a folder. We'll just create our little components folder. And inside this components folder, I'm going to create a component called inner. Okay, nothing too special about this. The whole purpose of this is we're just going to show how this inner component is going to be able to get access to the state without us specifically passing down the state as props. Okay, so we do want to import React because we're going to output some JSX. Okay. And then here, I'm going to create my function. So we'll say function inner. For now, we'll just say that it's not taking in anything. And then, of course, down below, we would typically just export default inner, right? We'll go with that. And then for now, we'll just return something so that we know it's working. We'll just say div hello from inner. Okay. Then I'll go into my app.js, and we're going to import this component. Oops, inside our components folder, inner. Okay, and then what I want to do is I want to, just going to take out, actually we'll leave it inside our app, this div that has a class name of app, because that gives us kind of some pretty awesome styles, right? Pretty sweet. All right, there, I've got my inner component and my stuff is still installing. Wow, slow internet today. Okay. Sorry, I can't even start the app until this is done, right? Actually, I can start it. Hold on. Let me create another terminal here. Whoops, not two terminals. And let's just get this guy started. Start. Can't find module, nice try. Does anyone have had any trouble with creating React apps recently? Has anyone created a React app today?
I cloned from GitHub and I had to install like dependencies, but I didn't have to create a new one from scratch.
Okay. Let me try taking a peek here. So if I go to create React app issues, seems to be an old issue. Let me just double check here. Okay, so if I just go back to issues, I just want to see. It only took 30 seconds, contrary to, yeah. Yeah, my internet connection at home has been really bad recently. I presume it's because so many people are home using the internet. Oh, is this it right here? That's really old, right? Oh, wow. Maybe it was just because those dependencies were in the process of being installed. I don't know. Pretty weird. So let's see. Okay, here we go. Hello from inner. So that's good. Great. Now let's go back to our app.js, and inside the app.js, this is where we're essentially going to set up our global state. You wouldn't typically do it from this file, but I'm just trying to keep things a little bit simple so that we can sort of see how the process goes. But typically you'd modularize and take this stuff out of here, okay? Okay, so in order for us, whoops, not there. In order for us to actually use Redux, we need to create what's called a reducer function, okay? And we'll talk about how this works a little bit more, but I'm going to create a function called reducer. And what the function is going to do is it's going to take in the state, whatever the current global state is in our application, and it's also going to take in an action, okay? The action is the thing that's ultimately going to allow us to update the state. Okay, so inside here, what we're going to do is we're going to create the format that you'll normally see for Redux is it typically uses switch cases. Okay, so we'll create a little switch case here. And that action object is going to have something called a type property inside of it, okay? The type property is the thing that tells us what kind of action was this, and then that enables us to update the state in the way that we want to, okay? So I'm going to switch based on what the type of the action is, okay? So now I'm going to create some different cases here. What we're trying to do is we're trying to create a scenario in which we either have a logged in user or we don't, okay? Pretty simple. We either have a user or we don't. So I'm going to say create a case here called login, whoops. And then so if this is a login case, that means that I want to update my state to have this user who just logged in, okay? So rather than me creating or mutating the original state, so the original state is right here, right? It's this object that I'm taking into my function. I'm going to clone that state and then update one part of it, which is just specifically going to be the user. Okay. So the job of the reducer function is that it needs to return back the brand new global state of the application. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to say return a new object, and then inside that object, I'm simply going to spread across the state. Okay, meaning that everything that was currently in my global state, I want to keep that. And then the one thing that I want to update here is going to be my user. Okay? And the place that I'm going to get the user is going to be from this action object right here. So the action object will have the type just saying what kind of action it is, and then it's typically going to have some data associated with it as well. Okay, so I'll say action.user. Okay, so that's one case, right? Another case might be I'm logging out. So we'll say log out. So if you guys had to guess, what am I going to want to return here once I've logged out? An object. Okay, true. It's going to be an object. It will be my new state. And spread state. Yeah, we'll want to spread state. And then you're saying user would be action.logout. Okay, it's a good guess. But let's do this. Let's say return a new object where we spread across the state, and then we'll say user is null. Right? Because I'm logging out, that means there is no longer a user in there. Okay, cool. So that's our second case. And then finally, we can also have a case, we'll just call this default. So if somebody passes the reducer function an action and we don't have it in either one of our types here, we're just going to return back whatever the current state is. Okay. All right, any questions? This is like basically how our whole reducer function is going to look. Any questions about what we're doing in there? Go like this.
Where are we defining like action.user? Yeah, user action.user, like I'm trying to figure out, trying to connect the dots between the two.
Yeah, we haven't yet, right? We haven't actually dispatched one of these actions, but we will. We will eventually do that. Yeah. Right now, we're just setting up the function. The function's job is to say, okay, if I get an action, now I know what to do with it. Now I know how to modify the state according to the action that you give me. Okay. All right. Good question, though. Yeah. It's kind of like, wait a minute, this is only partially done. And you're right. This is just the beginning, right? Okay. Cool. Now, the next thing that we need to do is we need to take this reducer function and we need to create what's called a store with it. The store is basically this big object that has all of our global state inside of it. Okay? So to create the store, we're going to import something from Redux. Create store from Redux. Okay? And then I can create it by doing this. I'll just say const store equals create store. Now I'm going to invoke this function. So when I invoke the create store function, I'm expected to pass in one of these reducer functions, like what we have here on line 8. So I'll pass that in. And then optionally, I can also specify what I want the original state to be, the initial state. So let's just create some initial state right here. We'll just say initial state equals an object that has a user property inside it, and we'll just say set it to null, right? So we're saying that originally, when the app loads up, there's not currently a user. So I can pass that in as the second argument to create store so that we have some kind of initial state. All right, now I've got a reference to this thing called a store, and that's required by Redux in order to be able to use it. Okay, so again, just to summarize, what the store is this is just our global state. Okay, whatever we put in there is part of the global state. All right, so in order to actually use this thing with React, I need to also import a special component from React Redux. So I'm going to say import provider from React Redux. Okay. And this is a component that I can use in my application. So typically what you would do is you would wrap everything with that provider component, because again, we want this to be a global state. So if I wrap everything in it, that means that everything will have access to our store. Okay, so I've got this provider here, and then in order to use it, I need to also pass it a prop. That's going to be the store that we created there on line 30. Okay, any questions at this point? All right. Did I lose anyone? Like, do we have thumbs down at some point? Like, someone's like, oh gosh, this is going too fast or whatever. It's kind of like sideways there. Yeah, sideways all around. All right, well, any clarifications that I can kind of cover here? Again, this store here is just, we're creating something that's going to hold all of the global state. All right.
I mean, I assume you're going to get to it, but I'm just wondering how to have children update the global store.
Yeah, we will definitely get to that. Yep, for sure. That's kind of like the next stop on the way. All right. So cool. Let's go inside here in our inner component, and we're going to import something from React Redux called connect. So I'm going to say connect from React Redux. And this function is going to allow us to actually connect this global store to this actual component that we have inside this file. Okay. So what I'm going to do, instead of just exporting default inner, I'm going to export default, oops, the result of connecting our inner, oops, we're going to call this connect function, okay? And then what that function is going to return us is actually going to be another function, which we can then call against our inner component, okay? Now you might be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, you're invoking connect here with nothing inside of it. And yeah, you wouldn't typically do it this way. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to pass in a function to this guy right here, this connect function, which will basically take the things that are inside of our global store and map them to props for our component, okay? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to create a function called map state to props, okay? And this function is going to take in whatever the current state is. That's our global state in the application, right? And it's going to return back an object that has the whatever pieces of the state that we're interested in. So if I'm interested in user here for this particular component, I'm going to say return an object that has a user inside of it, and I'm going to get that from the state object. Okay? So the job of this function, again, is to take whatever the current global state is and boil it down to some new object that just has whatever I'm interested in. Okay? So now I can pass that in here. I can say map state to props. All right? Now that we're doing this, now that we're mapping our global state to props, we'll actually be able to take in the user up here. Because notice I'm not just exporting the default inner function itself, I was doing some of this extra work down here on line 16. Okay, so let's make some use of this. Let's just have a situation. We'll say if, let's see, if there's a user, let's output some information about that user, right? So let's say we'll return some JSX. It'll just have a div in it. And then we'll have some p tags. So I'll say name, output the user's name, do email as well. Okay. And then maybe we also want to have like a logout button so that we can very quickly change the state here. We're not going to wire it up just yet, but I'm just going to create it. So we'll have this button here. Log out. All right. Okay, what if we don't have a user? Well, if we don't have a user, what we're going to want to have is some sort of a login button, right? So otherwise we'll say return. I'll create a button here called login. And then later on, we're going to attach something here so that this button actually does something, right? Okay, so let's save this as it is. Let's go back to our page here. And naturally, we've got a login button because we don't currently have a user, right? That was our initial state. Okay. So there's one other thing. When we invoke this connect function, it's also going to give us access in the component to to a function called dispatch, which means that I can take that in up here as a prop. Okay. And what dispatch allows us to do is it allows us to send an object to Redux telling it how we want to modify the state. Okay, so I'll create something inside here. So I'll just create a function called handle login. And what I want this function to do is I want it to dispatch what's called an action. That action, again, is going to be an object, right? So let's look back here and see what we're doing. So this is the action that we're going to dispatch. And the action is going to have a type, as you can see right here. And it's also going to have a user connected to it as well. Okay, so I'm going to dispatch this object. The type is going to be login. Okay, and for now, I'm just going to hard code some user data because I'm trying to keep it focused on Redux and not other stuff. But normally, you'd obviously be taking this in as input. You'd send a request back to the server. Server says, yeah, this person is who he or she says he is. Then you can update the store from that point. Okay, but we're just going to go ahead and update the store right away as if this worked. So we'll say the user is an object that has a name of Bob Smith. Email is going to be bob@smith.com. Okay, and then we're going to attach that to that button down here where we have login happening. So we'll say on click equals login, or handle login is what I made that. Okay. Normally, what would this function take in? See if you guys are paying attention. What? An event. Yeah, very good. Nice. Now we don't have to prevent any kind of a default here because we're not inside of a form, right? There's nothing to prevent. So we're good. Okay, cool. So let's test this out. Let's see if we can actually log in. I'll go back to my page here. Let's click this. There we go. Right? Bob Smith is now logged in. I have changed the global state of my application. All right. How about when we want to log out? So I'll create another little guy here, handle log out. And in here, I want to dispatch an action again. This time, what do I want the type to be? I want it to be log out, and it's got to match in the casing here, right? Okay. So by convention, you'll see when people are using Redux, they're doing all caps in the action types. And sometimes you'll see underscores in here as well, maybe something like that. Those are the conventions. Okay, so I'm going to dispatch that action right there, and then we need to attach this to the button. So say on click, handle log out. Okay, let's go back to our app here. So if I log in, Bob Smith is now logged in. If I log out, now I've got nobody, right? So I can very, very quickly toggle my state here. No, we're actually not doing any navigation at all. So if you see here, I've remained on my index route the entire time, right? If you did want to navigate somebody on logout, which probably would be a good idea, you would bake that into the function here. So it'd be something like after you dispatched this action, maybe you'd navigate them, right? Okay. Yeah, the if condition was just down here. So all we're saying here is that if there's a user, let's return out this JSX. Otherwise, we're returning this JSX. Yeah. Okay. Now, the other thing that I wanted to show you, because this tends to be sort of a little bit clunky, right? We had to create this function here. We also had to invoke this function called connect against this map state to props. And then we had to invoke what that gave us back against our actual component. But now that React has hooks, there are actually some Redux hooks that we can take advantage of. So instead of doing it this way, I can simplify things a little bit. So this is how things used to be done. And if you guys see code like this in legacy applications, you'll know why. It basically hasn't been updated to using hooks right now. Okay, so I'm going to comment this out. We'll go back to what we were doing before, which was just export default inner. Okay, but now I still want to be able to access dispatch and the user, right? Because those are important. All right. So I'm going to change what I'm bringing in from React Redux. I'm going to bring in a couple hooks here. I'm going to say use dispatch. That will allow me to get a hold of that dispatch function that I need. And then I'm also going to bring in another hook called use selector. Okay. So let's use those down here inside of my component. Rather than taking these guys in as props, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm now going to get them through hooks. So I'm going to say const dispatch equals use dispatch, and I have to invoke that function to get a hold of it. Okay. So by calling this hook function right here, I get access to the actual dispatch function that I needed. All right. The other thing that I wanted to have access to was my user as well. So the way that I can do that with this use selector hook is I can just say const user equals use selector, and I'm going to call that function again. Does anyone have an idea what I might be passing use selector, if you had to guess? Kind of always one of a few things, right? State. Okay, yeah, you're kind of on the right track there. ID, email, action, action. It's a callback function. Yeah, it's a callback function. So our callback function is going to take the global state of the application, and I'm just going to return out the part that I'm interested in, which is the user, right? So this is very much like that, like this function that we originally wrote down here, where we're mapping the state to the props, right? We were taking in the whole state object and we were returning out a new object with just the thing that we were interested in, which was the user in this case. Okay, but when we do it with use selector, we can create a bit of a kind of a shorter syntax here. We can just say we're taking in our state, and then we're returning out the user part of the state. All right, let's give this a shot here. Actually, hold on, let me refresh so we're making sure we're looking at the right thing. Okay, still working the exact same way. Okay, only with hooks, it's a little bit friendlier to use. Not as, maybe not quite as boilerplatey. All right. So one thing I wanted to touch on too before we kind of go through the code a little bit is just whether or not you even need to be using Redux. And this is a pretty important decision. It's not something that you're just going to bring into every project just because, like, hey, just because a lot of people are using Redux and it's this cool thing and I sort of know how to use it. You really only want to use it when your application has reached a certain level of complexity. If your application were as simple as the one that we just wrote right now, there would really be no need, right? I could simply pass a user to that inner component as a prop and be done with it. But what I'm doing is I'm showing you guys the concepts behind it so that you know if you're working on something that's a lot more complex that has maybe a component tree that was 5 to 10 levels deep or something like that, then maybe you'd need some kind of a state management tool like this. Okay? All right, cool. So let's go through what we did a little bit. Open up this app component again. Albert, take me through these lines here. So from 4 through the end of this guy here.
All right, we're importing create store from Redux, which
Good.
is essentially a global state.
Mm-hmm. What do you think create store is? Hang on.
Oh,
what is it?
Create store.
Yeah,
function. It's a function.
It's a function, right? Sometimes you have to check and see how things are being used. Good.
Yeah, and then import provider from React Redux. Provider is some type of parent component that
it's a component, yeah.
Yeah, that everything that's a child inside provider, that store we created gets passed down to all the children.
Mm-hmm.
Import inner is just one of the components that the test component you created.
Right.
The function reducer, it's required for Redux and it takes in 2 arguments. First one's the state. However, you're probably gonna have to run me through where we define that state again, and then the action, which is depending on what action is getting sent in from the child component, we're gonna activate the switch case, which is if the action.type is case login, it'll spread the state of the existing state and then reset the user to whatever we passed in from the child component when we activated login. And same state for same case for logout, except we are erasing the user from the state. And then if on line 21, if the action type does not match one of those, then we're just gonna do nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that we would do nothing. We'll just return back whatever the current state is. Yeah. So the state will be overwritten with the current state. It's as if nothing happened. You're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then again, can you go line 9? Where are we passing in? Oh, actually, no, we're calling that function somewhere else. I see. Okay.
Actually, yeah, and I was going to ask you guys this. Are we ever calling this function?
Oh, wait, does it get activated from the child component when they do that dispatch?
We never called this period, right? So therefore, it's essentially a callback function. It's a callback function that we're giving to Redux when we create our store, right? So it's going to be invoked on our behalf by Redux whenever we dispatch an action like we were doing. Okay, good. All right, cool. Prativa, take us through the rest of this here. So from here,
we are creating the initial state there in line 26, and our initial state will have the user to be null.
right?
And in line 30, we are creating the store. So store is basically we are creating a store by invoking the function create store and passing the function reducer and initial state there. And what basically store does do is holds the state for us.
Correct. Yeah, that's just an object that has all of our global state inside of it.
Yeah.
Right.
And inside our main, the app function, we are returning all of that, and we are wrapping all of our um, all of the divs or components by the provider, so that all of those components can have access to the store that we are passing as props there.
Yeah, exactly. That's the whole idea, is that we're sort of wrapping the entire application so that anything inside of this provider will have access.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, let's hop over to inner here. Francis, take us through, let's go through, you can just start from line 2 and go up to 16.
So we are importing use dispatch and use selector from React Redux.
And what are those?
They're hooks.
Yes, meaning that they are functions.
Oh, right, they're functions. And then we create this function called inner.
Mm-hmm.
And inside that, we have a const dispatch,
Right.
and we just invoke use dispatch.
So what's dispatch going to be? Do you remember?
No, not so much, because I'm still like I'm still trying to like understand it. It's a bit confusing for me.
Yeah,
So.
no, I understand. So we got a hold of this thing called dispatch. You can see it being used down here. How are we using that?
Oh, as a function.
It's a function, right? Exactly.
Right.
So this is giving us a reference to this function called dispatch.
Okay.
Okay. And then on
And
6,
we have a const user, and it also invokes use selector, which takes in a callback function
right?
of state, and we have state.user.
Yeah. So
Sorry, Morley, that's also still.
yeah, no, that's okay. The job of this callback function here is to take the state object and then just return out whichever piece of it we want to assign to this variable over here.
Okay.
Okay.
I see. Oh, cool.
Okay, cool. All right, and then we've got this little function down here. What's that?
Yeah, we have the function handle login, which will, as the name says, they'll be handling our login.
Right.
And we are calling that dispatch function.
Right.
It takes in an object that has type login and also user, which also has an object in it, and then just hard coded, and that is the name and email.
Yeah. So normally it wouldn't be like this in a real app. Obviously, we would make a request to our server. The server would come back and tell us this person successfully logged in. Here is the name and the email or something like that, right? And then that's what we would dispatch.
Right. Okay.
Is
Cool.
type action.type a native keyword? if we named it something like event name and action.event name, would that still work? Yeah. Yeah, you can call it whatever you want. So and this is kind of a rule of thumb for any function. If I'm creating this reducer function here, I don't have to call this action. I can call it whatever I want. This is the convention, though. You'll see state and action everywhere. So if you write your functions using something that's sort of out of the ordinary, people may have a tougher time understanding what it's doing, Yeah, exactly. But that's ultimately how you can write your functions. You can name the parameters whatever you want. Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Aya, go ahead and take us through that there.
You have the function handle logout. It calls the dispatch function, and then the type is logout. So it logs out, well, changes the user to null.
Good. So what is this thing that we're dispatching, this object here? Remember what that's called?
No.
So this is just called an action.
Okay.
Yeah, going right along with this, remember the reducer is taking in an action. Okay. So it's
Okay.
Redux that is calling this reducer function on our behalf.
Okay.
Okay, cool. And then down here.
And then if the user is there, then it returns all this, the name, email, and the logout button.
Good.
And if the user doesn't exist, then there's going to be a login button.
Yeah, exactly. So if we got past this, then we're just going to return out this here on the bottom. All right. Any other questions? You guys did great reading the code, by the way. I know that this is like a pretty tough concept. And that's, again, why I want to stress it's not something that you'll necessarily bring into every app because not every app is going to need it. It's just for situations where the app has grown pretty complex and you have a lot of nested components inside of it. Whenever you have kind of like complex state management. Can we go to the beginning of the inner? Sure. Was there something specific up here that you wanted to ask about, Prativa? Like lines 5 and 6? Or? No? How to connect this with JWT? I'm trying to visualize. Okay, that's cool. Yeah, so JWT, well, let's see. The JWT stuff is mostly going to be handled by your server. Now, in some tutorials that you might see on the internet, they might tell you something like, put the JWT inside local storage. What you can do is just understand that there are some security risks of that. If you put something into local storage, it's accessible by your client JavaScript. Okay, versus if you put the JWT in a secure cookie, your client-side JavaScript won't have direct access to that JWT, which means that you'll probably need to get the information about the user directly from the server. You would probably have to make a request, axios.get. Yeah, so if you had a certain part of your app, like let's say a person did a hard refresh, right? And when they do a hard refresh, it's kind of like we're starting from scratch. We don't really know anything about this user at that time. Yeah, maybe what you'd want to do is you'd want to make a GET request back to your backend and see, is there a user logged in right now? Was there a JWT inside their cookie? Okay. And then if you find out that there is, then you can proceed accordingly with your app. Or if you find out that there's not, then maybe you'd want to send them back to the login screen. Okay. So ultimately, don't store JWT in DB, axios.get. Yeah, you probably really don't need to store the JWTs in the DB unless you have more complicated needs with those. Like if you need to have a blacklist of JWTs that you're trying to revoke. Because normally that's the thing with JWTs is that they're not typically revocable. Once it's created, you know, it's always going to be like a valid JWT so long as it hasn't expired or anything like that. But if you wanted to have a blacklist or some sort of revoking list, yeah, maybe you would want to store those in the database. That's kind of up to you. When does JWT expire? Depends on if you set an expiration for it. So if you don't set an expiration, then it will be good indefinitely. If you set an expiration, then it would actually have an expiration. Yeah. So again, if there's a hard refresh and you want to find out who the user is, you can make that request back to the backend to find out, you know, is there a JWT connected to the cookie at that time, and then if there is, you can send back the user information to the front end. So probably in your top level component in your app or whatever, you would just display like a loading thing while you were going to try to find out if there was an actual valid user in there, right?
So if
we don't really know what we want to render just yet because we're trying to find out, do we have a logged in user or not? And we have
so
to
if
make
a user is logged in and then he commits a hard refresh, then the JWT gets erased, and then would it
No.
just automatically? Oh, it does not. Okay, not on a hard
Nope.
refresh.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, those cookies will stay with them so long as the cookie hasn't expired. Yeah. All right, cool. Thumbs? I see Albert's got a thumbs up. Yeah. Oh my gosh, Aya's brutal today. Okay. Yeah, I got an extra thumbs up. This is from Francis's husband. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
He was trying to sit in because he said he wants to learn about the hooks, Redux hooks.
Solid. Yeah, it's a good thing to know about. For sure. Okay. So Ian just needs to review it. Okay, but no particular questions about what we did. It just kind of looks funky to you. Okay. All right, no worries. I'll share the code actually through Mattermost so you guys can take a look at it. And yeah, it needs some time to process it. Sure. So after you guys have had some time to look at it, if you have any further questions, just let me know. But yeah, that's sort of the long and short of how we can create some global state in our app. Cool. All right, let me stop the share here. Stop the recording.